This is a story you've never heard before. It will never be in the official records. And in the great scheme of things, it's an insignificant event that didn't cause the rise of an empire or even the fall of a tyrant. A small blip in a galaxy-wide conflict that ended on the other side of the ring in the most unlikely ways. This story doesn't have any heroes or any villains. No names that anyone will recognize. And no places that will be remembered after you. But once you hear it, you'll understand why this is a tale. It was cold. It was always cold on this rocky planet. It had a name once upon a time, but now it was just called Sector 5. On the map, it showed up as an insignificant part of the western front of the war. But that only mattered to fleet admirals and commanders that pushed buttons and moved ships and divisions around, without actually needing to do anything as so much as stand up. The population, they cared even less. They left long ago for any other place. Any other place. And the only reason the fighting continued was the importance that this place had as a fueling station for long-range transport ships carrying war materials from one side of the galaxy to the other. Both sides were exhausted from the endless fighting. The war had a reason, had a purpose, but these were the lofty goals and vague desire expressed to bring all people together under the imperial flag. But all that meant was the troops actually fighting the war was that the phrase victory or death seemed to have taken on a meaning that emphasized the latter over the former. Our story is about a squad taking part in this grand campaign. Part of the 26th Brigade of the 18th Division, and having been created out of recruits from the same core world, they called themselves the Firestorm Squad. Partly because of the commander's optimistic hope that they would take inspiration from the name. In reality, the name stuck because it reminded the troops that there was a thing such as warmth. While the squad was made up of pilots, soldiers, and support crew, all were equally tired. All were equally cold. And all of them missed their home planet and their traditions.
We never knew what kind of mission the day would bring. One day we were flying escort missions, bringing supply ships down from a visiting fleet freighter. And the next day we'd be tasked with mapping out someplace that had gotten plastered by the fighting and had the landscape changed. Most of the time it was boring, repetitive flying, but every so often the squad would find itself in another mess, and we'd be asked to fly cover for them. It was an ugly business. There was never anything glorious about it, just hoping you wouldn't get blasted and come down in the mud and muck.
The Stormtrooper Corps of the squad had taken the worst beating. Between being forced to live in the field for days and having to put up with not only the harsh elements, but pot shots as well as the occasional raid, the troopers that started out as a proud group of recruits spit shined and organized, was now a group that sported armor that looked like they'd found it in a garbage disposal, and faces that were haggard and unkempt.
Thinking of home was something you didn't want to do. It was just too hard. Back at the village, when the year turned cold, we knew that it was time to rest from all the work we did in the fields and celebrate the holiday. The whole village would come together and we'd do the typical fare of playing games and singing songs. We would give each other gifts and look forward to what the next year would bring, surrounded by our family and friends. It was a time to be together. You didn't want to think about that. You didn't want to think about that here.
We all joined the Imperial military together. It was a proud moment when we all stood together and took the oath. It felt right, like we were defending our homes and families. We had no idea we'd be sent so far away for so long. I'd hoped I'd serve on a Star Destroyer with the others in my squad, but they sent us here to Sector 5. And now I'm doing double shifts trying to keep our command post operational and the rest of our squad supplied. It hasn't been going well.
Normally, being assigned to armor carried some glamour with it. By the time I finished my basic infantry training, I knew that I wanted to be at the controls of one of the Empire's big war machines. Growing up, one of the best parts of the year was harvest time, when I got to drive our big collector. As it rumbled over the furrows, I imagined that it was a pulse tank, or even an AT-AT, the pinnacle of Imperial might. When I was accepted in the armor training program, I thought that when I finally deployed with my squad, I would experience the same thrill that I felt as a boy. By the stars, was I wrong.
When the Firestorm Squad arrived at Sector 5, their situation had quickly gone from bad to worse. The bulk of their naval detachment had been called away, needed to press the war against the rebellion elsewhere. What was once a proud brigade was reduced to one squad, made up of infantry, command and support staff, and a few pilots flying increasingly unreliable, old model type aircraft.
When we landed, we had plans for a grand campaign that would end the fighting by the end of the year. After weeks of trading ground with the rebels, though, we ended up digging in and hoping we could hang on. It was one thing when we had supplies coming in, but now we just send out the occasional patrol and try to secure the gains we've made. The orders that we get don't make any sense. It's like command doesn't understand that what we look like on the datapad doesn't reflect the situation we have here. We can't win and we can't leave.
Flying over Sector 5, it was easy to see just how dug in each side was. Fortified positions dotted the landscape. Although there was little in the way of combat, occasionally you'd see the sparkle of a blaster bolt fired at some poor soul who had unwittingly exposed themselves. Most of our job on patrol was to keep an eye on things below, make sure the X-Wings on the other side weren't getting too bold. Boring, with sudden moments of sheer terror, is the best way that I can describe those patrols.
We could hear the fighters scream across the sky, making that weird howl of theirs. Most of the time, you kept your head down, but every now and then an X-Wing or two would show up when our pilots were over the lines, and when that happened, the rules for us on the ground changed. Without even thinking about it, both the rebels and us would stop worrying so much about shooting each other and instead cheer for our pilots. They were thrilling displays of light and noise, and the most satisfying outcome for both sides was when the pilots had to break off and return to base without someone being shot down. No one liked to think too much about what happened to a pilot who crashed on the surface, but I don't think I've ever cheered that loudly for anything else when the ships were twisting around in the sky.
There wasn't really any honor in what I did. The rebels didn't really have much to match the Walker in the beginning, and it was almost an unpleasant surprise to see how easily the big machine crushed any infantry unfortunate enough to be in its path. I'd trained to fight, and I guess I always thought it would be a fair fight.
turned into months, and the situation, despite the wishes of higher command, was a stalemate. Neither side had the strength to break the other, and neither side was willing to concede the ground. So Firestorm Squad remained tightly locked in a fight they couldn't win, and hope of ever getting home seemed further and further away.
We'd been deployed for, 8 or 9 cycles, and had begun realizing that we weren't going to be home for the holidays. We all missed our families, although it was almost an unwritten rule that you didn't talk about it. Most of us had never been off our homeworld before this, much less known anything about the devastation that war brought to a place. Missing our holiday traditions almost seemed trivial, but we did what we could. A decoration on the wall of the command post or a little sprig of something alive tucked into a trooper's armor served as a reminder that there was another place where people didn't have to walk around crouched over and where the sky was lit up with fireworks, not laser bolts.
We tried our best to keep up traditions where we could. Most of us still wore our people's sign around our necks, despite the Empire's disdain for such things. And little gestures like pressing our palms in greeting or humming a song were quietly observed. Our officers looked the other way most of the time, and I think they were as homesick and tired of the fighting as we all were.
Order, uniformity, obedience. That's what was drilled into us at the academy. It was our job to keep the troops in our squad motivated and fighting. The longer that we were deployed, however, the harder it got. We wanted to get home as badly as anyone else, and between ourselves, we were just as angry as the squad was that we'd seemingly been forgotten in this place.
As the time for the winter celebration approached, the members of Firestorm Squad hunkered down and hoped they'd made it through until the fleet returned. There was almost no thought for comfort or home. But every now and then, some little oddity would take place that was just enough to keep a flame of hope alive, that this would end someday.
Over in my section, we found a tree that had been cut down by the shelling, but had somehow survived intact. Someone said it kind of looked like a tree we had back home, which got us all to thinking about the celebrations we were missing. So we hoisted the tree over our bunker one night when it was quiet. There were some rebels that took a few pot shots at it, but remarkably, it stayed intact, looking out of place in the landscape covered by duracrete and mud.
Discipline was lax on the front lines. We'd heard that some outposts had foolishly put up decorations that reminded them of home, and officially we tried to stop it whenever we could. But there's only so much you can tell soldiers who are less afraid of punishment than they are of what's directly in front of them. We even got some reports that singing was heard from the rebel lines, but that seemed too far-fetched even for this place.
Now we come to the part of the story that's so remarkable. In a place with so much misery, on the eve of what should be a day of celebration, all that the squad had to look forward to was more of the same dreary survival. But what could possibly happen in this place so far from home, so far from family? It would be worth telling.
I think it started that evening. It was a quiet night, and even the sharpshooters seemed uninterested in looking for fresh targets. In the command post, we received the usual all clear and quiet calls from the various outposts, and we settled in for another long night. Our food preparation staff was trying to pull something special together for the meal that would be served to the squad in the morning. But given how low on supplies we were, it seemed like the holiday would pass without much in the way of recognition. That all changed when we started hearing transmissions from the pilots who were flying the last patrol of the day.
It was the oddest thing that I saw in that patrol. All throughout the rebel lines, we saw little twinkling lights. It almost looked like I'd imagined our village did back home, with the dark, cold night being softly lit by the promise of family and celebration. But it seemed foreign and out of place in Sector 5. We transmitted what we saw, knowing that the morning would bring a new round of flights designed to discover the purpose of this new development.
I had just finished the paperwork for the evening and stepped out of our command post on the line. It was clear and calm, and unlike some nights, both sides seemed content to let the other rest. As I stood, I thought that I heard the faint sound of singing in the distance, as if it was coming from the enemy's lines. I started walking up to our forward positions to see if I could determine what the source of the sound was.
Yes, we could hear the rebels singing, and it sounded so much like one of our holiday songs that we decided to serenade them back. No sooner had we finished our song than the rebels came back with their musical reply, and so it went back and forth. The officers just watched, not wanting to interfere on the night that at home would be Holidays Eve, and for just a few minutes everyone felt a little bit normal again.
Two sides, locked in mortal combat, surrounded by misery in a place so far from home that the light from their star wasn't even a speck in the sky. Singing to each other. That is truly remarkable. But the last part of this story is what will convince you that it was a tale worth telling.
So when we woke up in the morning, the front was all quiet. There was a mist, enough that you couldn't see the other lines. We slowly started preparing for the patrol that was coming and tried not to think about how much different things were here on this day of holiday than what we had known at home.
We sent the patrol orders and crossed our fingers that this would be a day when everyone came back in one piece. If there was any day that would merit that, surely this day would be the one.
I was assigned to a patrol as the armored liaison. I don't think any trouble was expected, but they liked having one of us along so that we could call in armored support if it was needed, while the infantry set up a clear corridor for our scout walkers to get to them.
I led the stormtrooper detail out into the ground between the lines. Our job was to look for any changes in the terrain and to note anything that would potentially hinder what we all knew was the inevitable attack to break the stalemate. The fog was shifting around enough that I couldn't clearly see where we were, and I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me as I saw movement in the mist ahead of us. Suddenly, I realized that I wasn't seeing things. It was a rebel patrol, and they brought their blasters up at the same time we did.
The muzzles on their blasters look as big as dinner plates. Everyone froze. It was so quiet that you could hear the droplets of water falling off our armor and hitting the ground. I mean, we all knew what was about to happen. And then, out of the silence, a voice just started singing from the rebel lines. I didn't recognize the song, but it sounded hopeful and cheerful. And then a heartbeat later, an Imperial voice joined in from our lines. As we stared across our blasters at each other, we heard more from both sides join in.
I don't know why I did it. Both patrols had their weapons leveled and pointed straight at each other. Maybe it was because I heard the singing that had started. If that was it, it was just a reaction that happened well before I could think it through, I guess. I straightened up, stepped forward, and held out my hand. I don't know what I was expecting to happen. That should have been the last thing I ever did. It was dead silent, except for what had become a chorus of voices that we could now clearly hear. After what seemed like an eternity, one of the rebels smiled and lowered his blaster. Reaching out, he grabbed my hand. We greeted each other as old friends would, while what I had done slowly started sinking in.
We had just crossed into the airspace between the lines when we saw 4 X-Wings entering the same space. S-foils locked and lasers at full power. We prepared to face them, but we knew this was likely to result in a bad ending for our patrol. Over the comm, our flight leader suddenly called out that he saw something unusual below us. Moments away from a full engagement with rebel fighters, I looked down into the space between the lines and saw rebels and Imperials standing together, weapons lowered, and shaking hands. What did it mean?
With the fog rapidly clearing between the lines, what started as 2 patrols lowering their weapons and shaking hands turned into something so unusual that it was almost unbelievable. Soldiers from both sides left their fortifications and began walking towards each other, waving and exchanging greetings. In the skies overhead, pilots powered down their weapon systems and waggled their wings at each other. Officers either passively watched as the spirit of the holiday took over the lines, or sought out their counterparts and exchanged their own pleasantries, and offered what small comforts they had in their possessions.
I found out that the rebels, just like us, had all signed up together. And like us, they were missing a celebration that was traditional with their people. I had no idea that these soldiers were so much like me. We called the holiday by different names, but when we looked at each other, we knew that even though some of the names and customs were different, we all missed our families and all wished we were home with them. You know, I never thought I'd see the day when I could take off my helmet and share a drink with a rebel, alliance, soldier. But I did that day.
My channel's lit up with reports coming in about the remarkable thing happening across the battlefield. We couldn't believe it. Imperials and rebels celebrating peacefully? High Command was furious. Message after message came in demanding that we immediately resume combat operations. In the squad command post, we came to an unspoken agreement that for as long as the truce held, our long-range comms would malfunction. We even managed to get a few of the rebel comm operators on frequency and wish them a happy holiday.
I stood and talked with a few of the Reb Alliance officers. I gave them some of our traditional holiday cookies that I had in my pack, and they shared some sort of beverage that burned a little when I drank it, but reminded me of sitting at home watching my little brothers play by the fire. We swapped stories about our families and what we'd be doing if we weren't at Sector 5. What we said was a little bit different, but we all meant the same thing. I didn't know when this truce would end, and I didn't really care.
That day was truly one of the most astonishing holidays that anyone there could remember. Laughter rang out across the desolate land between the lines. And there was even a game involving a ball with very few rules. That evening, while the troops sang across the lines, pilots from both sides flew together, not dropping bombs, but signal beacons and flares that had been reprogrammed to overload and produced the most colorful explosions that had ever been seen in the place. No one knew what the days to come would bring. Uncertainty is part of a soldier's life, and all were accustomed to living without paying too much attention to the future. for that day, the war stopped in Sector 5. Now that you've heard this remarkable story that you won't hear anywhere else, what will you choose to do with it? Was it a fluke? Something that was an accident? Or does it show something more? Something that reaches out and touches us all.